Welcome to the Conservation Chronicles, the podcast from the Wildlife Trust for Lancashire, Manchester and North Merseyside. I'm Jenny Bennion, your host for today. And today we are talking all things peat, a sometimes slightly overlooked habitat that might not get the recognition that it really deserves. But to help us change all that, we've got a couple of brilliant guests today. We've got Sarah Johnson, who is our head of Peatland Nature Recovery, and Helen Earnshaw, who is our Peatlands Programme Project Manager. Yeah, you got that one right. Let's just start with the basics. What is a peatland?
Helen, do you want me to do that one?
You go.
Okay. What is a peatland? That's a good question. Simply put, I wanted to say chocolate cake. It might, well, I'm going to start off by saying, actually, when you go out onto it, if you're someone like me, you look at this beautiful, moist, deep brown soil beneath your feet, and I just think chocolate cake.
It sounds like a chocolate
it is
cake.
like, I love it. I just love it so much. But it's not just because the fact that it looks like chocolate cake if it's in a healthy, wet form. But what is peatland? Peatland is something you find all over the world. We have a lot of it in the northwest UK, but it's found on, I think, practically all continents. And peatlands form in sort of very wet, moist conditions. They are made up of essentially slowly decomposing vegetation. Yeah. And because of the waterlogged acidic nature of these environments, it breaks down very slowly. And as it does that over a very, very, very slow period, it breaks down and forms peat soils.
Cool. So we've got these wonderful kind of...
Okay.
I get it, yeah. We've got these wonderful kind of boggy, waterlogged environments, but what makes them so special? Like, why should we care about...
Why should we care? Why should we care about peat bogs? Well, firstly, they are amazing, unique habitats, and you find wildlife there that you find nowhere else, which is adapted to that very sort of what can seem to be a hostile environment, but they're adapted to cope and thrive in those environments. So you get amazing plants, like carnivorous plants, which are adapted to be carnivorous because they can't get the nutrients they need from the soil, so they essentially trap insects in their sticky, gooey, tentacle-like things that they have, and they get the nutrients they need to grow from the insects that they trap. So you have these amazing plants and other wildlife that are adapted to those conditions. So things you'll find nowhere else. So from a wildlife point of view, they're amazing. I would like to think of them as our like mini rainforests. Okay, they might not look like your tropical rainforest of Borneo, but they're as important in terms of the climate benefits they provide. So because of the fact that how they're made up of slowly decomposed plants. They trap a lot of the carbon that those plants take in when they're growing, and that's trapped and locked into the peaty soils. So as long as peatlands are kept sort of waterlogged as a waterlogged environment, they store that carbon for millennia, forever, unless they're damaged or drained in any way. So from a climate point of view, they're amazing. Right. They can help to slow down sort of water flow, so in terms of helping to mitigate against high rainfall events and provide flood mitigation. So they have loads of climate benefits, but they're also amazing places for wildlife. And we're really lucky that in the northwest of the UK we have a lot of these precious peatlands, both in the uplands and lowlands.
So basically they're a bit of a kind of superhero of the habitat world.
Absolutely.
That's brilliant. And are there different types of peatlands, or, is peat just peat?
Helen, do you want to take that one? Do you want me to do that? You can do that. Okay. So yes, there are different types of peatlands. I mean, all peatlands have these benefits that we're talking about in terms for wildlife and the climate and places for people to go and enjoy. But so in our region, for example, we have in the lowland areas, so around Greater Manchester and North Merseyside and West Lancashire, we have you would have had a lot of what's called lowland raised bog or fen soils. And then, unfortunately, we only have a fraction of the lowland raised bogs left in any reasonably good condition, because a lot of it's been drained and converted for agriculture, farming, horticulture, development. But that we at one time would have had thousands of hectares of lowland raised peat soils, and they kind of are created in almost like lowland bowl areas, and the peat would have accumulated over a long time to create like a dome shape. That's why they call lowland raised bogs. In the
sense.
uplands, you more typically find what's called blanket bog, and you get other types of peat in between. But in our area, we generally talk about blanket bog, which is associated with the upland habitats. You think about the West Pennines and the Forest of Bowland, that kind of area. And then we have a lot of lowland raised bog, which is found more around West Lancashire, around Greater Manchester and places like that.
Brilliant. And Helen, can you tell us a bit more about some of the sort of wildlife that we might find on these wonderful peatlands?
Despite the fact that they've been described many times as desolate, barren places, lowland raised bogs in particular are teeming with wildlife.
Wow.
And actually the best way to look at the wildlife of a lowland raised bog is with your face really close to the ground, because that's where all the action is. The plant species, because they're acidic conditions and poor nutrient conditions, they don't grow tall vegetation like you see on grassland or woodlands. They're only a few centimetres from the ground. So we've already talked about the exciting sundew, and that is probably the most fascinating of the plants.
That's one of the carnivorous plants.
It is. It's one of the carnivorous plants, and the round-leaved sundew is the one that's most common across all of our sites here in Lancashire and Greater Manchester. But we have brought back the great sundew and the oblong-leaved sundew to our triple SI site up at Winmarleigh Moss. And they hadn't been seen on the site for about 100 years. So it's exciting to have brought those species back. But plants are the key driver to these habitats. You've not only got your sphagnums and your sundews, there's hare's tail and common cotton grass, you've got your cranberry, your bog asphodel. So plant-wise, they're teeming with life. And the thing about these plant species is that they're endemic to this habitat, so you will not find them anywhere else. You cannot go into a local woodland or a local grassland to spot them. You have to go to these remote bogs where they thrive and establish, because they can't survive anywhere else.
And some of them aren't actually that remote though, are they? So we think about the mosslands in Chatmoss, there's 10 miles from the centre of Manchester. We've got bogs literally on the doorstep of a lot of people. Not always accessible, but they're there. You mentioned sphagnum moss. I forgot to say about that. Obviously, sphagnum moss is the building block of peat. That's the essential ingredient of peat. Do you want to talk a bit more about sphagnum moss?
Moss is boss. It is the building block of the entire habitat. It is the engineer of the habitat. It acidifies the conditions. It keeps the water in the habitat. It's the plant that breaks down to create the peat in the first place. So without sphagnum, these habitats simply wouldn't be able to exist. It's the driving force of any lowland raised bog.
It's amazing. It can store up to 20 times its weight in water alone. That's why it's so great, as being like a sponge in terms of, holding water, slowing the flow when we have these high rainfall events. So sphagnum is a super cool plant.
And its rootless nature means that it can, you only need to drop a tiny section of it and it will anchor and establish and thrive. You can put it on the peat itself, you can throw it into pools of water and it will quickly establish and start to engineer the habitat. It really is quite a remarkable plant.
And very resilient.
Oh, wow. And I believe sometimes you can be found stood on the edge of bog pools just chucking it around.
Absolutely. So there's nothing better than throwing a bit of sphagnum around. We do it with our volunteers fairly regularly on some of our Manchester sites. It's a really good way to get people invested in the site and feel like they're contributing to the site. Just grab a handful of sphagnum and just start throwing it around. And it's amazing how quickly it will colonise those large pools of water that are created at the start of restoration work. And it's the sphagnum that slowly reduces the open water to create a more vegetation dominant habitat.
So we should say it is a translocation process. It's not just because we like throwing it around. It's fun, but it's also a process of trying to translocate sphagnum to other parts. And it wouldn't be just any species. It would be the species that thrive in the more sort of, some like it. Some can cope with like pool type watery areas, whereas some less so. So we the team know about the different species of sphagnums and which one is appropriate to throw into a pool and which one needs to be put somewhere else.
Wouldn't like it quite so much.
Yeah, at the start of our restoration work on any site, we usually plant cuspidatum because it is the species of sphagnum that can best tolerate higher nutrient levels that we find in the soil at the start of any restoration process, simply because the peat has been so degraded or drained or under agriculture or for whatever reason. reason it's not in pristine condition. It's cuspidatum that goes in first to help start to engineer those conditions.
Kittens, which is that one?
Yeah.
One has a common name, drowned kittens, which is not very nice, but it kind of gives you the idea it's quite furry looking.
Sort of, yeah.
Splatty.
So, okay, talking about the restoration of peatland sites, tell me a little bit more about the story of Little Woolden Moss, which I believe is in Greater Manchester and has had quite a life.
Based just outside of Earlham, it was once part of a much larger chat moss peat mass, but over years and decades and centuries, it's been drained, put under agriculture predominantly, and those peat fragments have shrunk, so very little of lowland raised bog actually is there in any sort of decent condition. It's all pretty poor. Little Woolden Moss in particular was extracted on an industrial scale. It was used for fuel, it was used in horticulture, and when we first bought the east side of the site, you could actually see all of the wagons on the west side. So while we were starting the restoration process on the east, it was still being extracted on the west.
And what was the peat being extracted for?
So it's for peat to be used and bagged up as compost. So to destroy, essentially destroying one habitat to create another one, i.e. a garden. And if you'd gone there at that point, it would have looked like a barren moonscape, absolutely devoid of any vegetation at all, drained, very dry, just nothing, deep drains. It was being, industrially extracted.
And so fast forward a few years, what does it look like now?
The transformation in the 10 years that we've started to acquire the land is pretty remarkable. They said it was a site that could never be restored. And that's simply not true. The east side, the vegetation now is the engineer of the habitat. The sphagnums, cotton grasses are well established and are controlling the levels of water that are in the site. The pools have been drastically reduced, so the vegetation is now the key driver. As you move towards the east, the vegetation isn't as well established and developed as on the east because it's been under restoration for a shorter period of time. But to say it's chalk and cheese from 10 years ago would be an understatement. It really is an incredible looking site now.
Wow.
Because it's by no means, the job is by no means finished. But in the 10 years that we've had it and under restoration, it's moved remarkably faster than I think that some people expected it to. And I think, when it takes so long to create peat soils in the first place, I think it's, 1 millimetre a year can be laid down, new peat soils, but then, extraction, you're losing, hundreds of years in a single year. Do you know what I mean? Like in terms of how it's commercially extracted. So the process to replace what was lost is going to be, take a long time. But the work we're doing is putting it in the right place that it can move forward positively.
I mean, that's great. It's really good to hear that there is kind of hope for some of these really, peatlands that might not have been very nicely treated in the past.
No, and it would have been seen as a wasteland and probably a bit of a no-go area for the local communities as well, I think, in the past, because of how it was being used and how it looked. But the Trust has done a lot as well to make it more accessible to the general public so they can really appreciate this precious habitat that they have on their doorstep. So there's, through Little Woolden Moss, there's a footpath that people can walk through, and we've done a lot in the past working with other teams as well to bring in sort of school groups and other community groups to really demonstrate what we have on our doorstep that we should really be protecting.
And so what are some of the challenges with our peatlands? Why are our peatlands in such a kind of poor state? What's happened to bring us to this?
Well, I think it is the fact that they were seen as wastelands for a long time, and Helen talked about Chat Moss. That was the place of the first railway, Manchester Liverpool Railway, the floating railway, and it was seen as somewhere to take stuff from and dump stuff back. So night soils, from the big cities were put out onto the peatlands, so they weren't. I think the understanding of what they provide in terms of climate, mitigation things wasn't understood at that point. So they were drained to be converted to agriculture or to use in horticulture. And the moment you drain the peat soils, that's when you start, and they move from being a carbon store to a carbon source. And you start, the peat soils are oxidizing and blowing off into the atmosphere and degrading year on year. So the farmers that we speak to are still conventionally farming it, drained peat soils. They're saying they're losing back equivalent of a brick depth of peat every 5 years. Wow. So in some areas, if we don't change how they're managed, that peat soil will be gone in the next within the current generation, really.
Gosh. And so just to come back to the sort of climate impacts of peatlands. So I believe that globally peatlands store 1/3 of all terrestrial or sort of soil carbon. But what's my stat here? Yeah, in the UK alone, around 5% of our greenhouse gas emissions come just from degraded peatlands. Yep. So how does that work? Why are peatlands such either great carbon stores, and then how do they become carbon sources?
Peatlands are only carbon stores if they are kept wet. Right. Wet all year round. That is what helps them become those carbon sinks that we need to help fight climate change. When they are drained, degraded, extracted, and that water is lost, all of the carbon dioxide that has been sequestered into the soils and captured in the soils it's released and emitted. So lowland raised bogs, or bogs in general, have a huge role to play in battling climate change and reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we've lost 98% of our lowland raised bogs in the northwest of the UK and across the UK as a whole. Yeah. Now, these landscapes were lost when people perhaps did not understand the implications of drying and degrading the peat soils. And so we've emitted a lot of greenhouse gases through ignorance, but we're not ignorant anymore. And so we need to make sure we're taking in as many fragments of this habitat as we possibly can. And we accept that you can't restore every piece, because those that are under agriculture need to remain under agriculture because we need to continue to feed the country. But areas that are incredibly wet, where you can no longer traditionally farm, or fragments that are just left fallow, need to be put into some kind of re-wetting restoration process to try and help mitigate the greenhouse gas issue that is becoming more and more apparent and more urgent every year.
Yeah. So tell me about wetter farming then. I know that's something that the peat team are doing a lot of work in at the moment, but yeah. What is it and why are you doing it?
So what is wetter farming? It's a good question. As Helen mentioned, the vast majority of our peat soils in the area have been drained and converted primarily for agriculture. And although we try and take, put into conservation those areas that we can, pragmatically, the vast amount of agricultural peat soils aren't going to come back into restoration. It just economically won't make sense for the communities in the region. So we're working with farmers to look at what other ways these agricultural peat soils can be managed that is better environmentally and from a climate point of view, but can still provide an income for farmers who need to make a living. So wetter farming is essentially growing, it's still a form of agriculture, and it's growing crops that thrive in sort of more waterlogged wetter conditions that can grow with a high water table, essentially, on agricultural peat soils. So we have several pilots. How many projects now? We have about five projects in Greater Manchester or Lancashire, which are working with farmers to test what crops can be grown at what's high water table. So we're looking at what will grow. How can you re-wet a field and not flood your neighbours? If you're growing those crops at a high water table, what does that mean in terms of the yields you can get? What's the business model that will support this? And what are the policy drivers that need to be put in place as well? So we're looking at food crops. We're looking at sphagnum moss growing as a carbon crop. We're looking at growing typha, which is bulrush, which can be, the seed heads are being used by a company to create the insulation for puffer jackets. So looking at plant-based alternative
which
material.
I believe has a really great name. for the jackets, the filling?
Biopuff.
Biopuff.
I was like, yes, it does. Yes.
I just think the name Biopuff is brilliant. Whoever came up with that should get a lot of gold stars.
I know. And it was really great there because we need to show the economic argument to farmers and land managers of moving towards more this sustainable land management for agricultural peat soils. So if you can demonstrate that, yes, there is a crop that will thrive grow at a high water table, and yes, there is a market for this product, and it's a high-end product if it's going into sort of, your outdoor gear puffer jackets, you're showing there's a end-to-end, alternative out there which would hopefully be equitable in terms of income, but we're still in the sort of trial stages looking at what is the art of the possible. That's why we've got number of field scale trials ongoing, and there's other trials going elsewhere in the UK and also abroad as well. So in the Netherlands and Germany, there's also an Ireland, there's trials ongoing as well.
So what about food production? Obviously, if a lot of this land is currently under agriculture, being used to grow crops to feed the country, as much as I love the idea of Biopuff because it's a really amazing name, like we can't eat bulrushes.
Absolutely. So we have to. I think there's going to be some uncomfortable conversations that have to happen about what can be grown where.
Yeah.
So it's going back to that. So there's way back. It's been going for some time, this idea of land sharing and land sparing, thinking about what you can grow, where do we need to think differently how we grow our food crops? Because yes, we don't just want to export the problem to somewhere else, So it is looking at maybe there are the food crops that will still grow, conventional food crops. So we're looking at celery and lettuce and radishes and blueberries so far. So those are things that we already eat, that are already grown in this country. How do they cope with a high water table? What happens to the yields? But yeah, we are going to have to think about what should we grow where. Should we be growing a lot of our food on peat soils, or do we need to think differently? But that's something that has to happen at policy level as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we've always said that it needs to be a mosaic of habitats. So a monoculture of anything, whether it's typha or a food crop, is not great for biodiversity. So if you have, X amount of acres on your farm and you're growing wheat or potatoes, if you've got, a corner of the field that is incredibly wet that you can no longer farm traditionally, so it's either losing you money or not making you anything, you might as well try to grow an alternative crop, because at least it would give you some form of income that's better than nothing. And so we envisage that you would have a farm of traditional agriculture, wetter farming, maybe a little bit of restoration, all living side by side and all providing not only economic stability for you as a landowner with your business, but they can also offer wider environmental benefits. So boosting biodiversity, water storage, water quality, all of which can be tied into some kind of stewardship going forward.
Yeah, and income. Yeah, because I think that the farmers that we're working with, they've approached us, or we've made partnerships with them because they all have had areas of their farmland which they are struggling to manage profitably, because it's it's sitting wet for certain months of the year, and they're looking for alternatives. So when we first started our what we call wetter farming journey about 5 years ago now, we were when we set up the first trial, we're like, I wonder what the reception will be like from farmers in the area. But we're actually surprised that there was curiosity about what we were doing, and that's led on to further partnerships where we've got field scale trials which are being designed and managed by the farmers themselves. And I think ultimately we're a wildlife trust, we're not farmers. We'd like it to get to a point where it's farmers working with other farmers, and that it's farm to farmer knowledge transfer rather than a wildlife trust do it with farmers. But we're because it's quite early on in the pilot stages, and we're able to maybe secure funding to support trials. That's where we're helping to move the conversation on in terms of what we can do with our agricultural peat soil areas.
And I mean, historically, unfortunately, has been a little bit of us and them between farmers and, you know, us here on the side of conservation. And that's not what we want or need to help tackle this problem. And that's what's been the lovely thing about these trial projects, is that we've worked hand in hand with the farmers on the land, whether it's their farm or whether they're tenants. And we've built up these really good positive relationships about how farming and conservation can marry and go forward hand in hand to collectively find solutions to the problems that agriculture is facing, particularly agriculture on peat soils. And that's been a really, really nice side to the project. And as Sarah said, you know, we weren't sure about how things were going to be received and what farmers were going to think about the work that we were doing or trying to do. And the reception that we've got, certainly in the last 18 months, has been incredibly positive. We're seeing more and more farmers and landowners coming forward to talk to us about the work that we're doing and about the possibility of us helping and supporting them make that first step into alternative land management, because they're realising that is the way it is going to have to be. There is going to have to be a little bit of change somewhere in their business model along the way. And so it's very much become this collaborative process that has become the really nice part and the really fulfilling part of these projects.
And I think, you know, that's amazing that you're managing to kind of create these relationships with farmers. What about sort of policymakers and government and stuff? Is there a role that needs to be played
absolutely.
From that side as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've certainly seen that the Peatland Programme for Lancashire Wildlife Trust has grown exponentially over the last 5 years, and that partly reflects sort of the focus from policy as well. I think the recognition of the role that peatlands can play in terms of climate mitigation. So that has that policy recognition has driven some of the funding and some of the work that we're doing. And also, I think more recently, the recognition of lowland agriculture peat soils and the role they particularly play in reducing carbon emissions is driving policy development. And so we've been working quite closely and feeding in when we can to the policymakers and DEFRA to try and feed in learnings from what we're doing to move policy forward. It's still not quite there, and I think, you know, with the change in the environmental stewardship options coming down the line, that's quite positive, I think, in terms of some of the new countryside stewardship options are offering quite well-paying options for high water table management of agricultural peat soils, for example. So I think that's really positive, but we still need to keep pushing forward because obviously at the moment, you know, the economic crisis of the country really means that, you know, decisions have to be made on where money should be spent. And so I think we have a role to play to keep pushing the government and policymakers to not take their foot off the gas in terms of support for peatlands, both financially through the funding they provide for peatland restoration, but also in terms of supporting the farming community to develop sort of wetter farming, pluticulture practices. So they do have a role to play, because there's going to be a certain element of top-down policy drivers to enable farmers, for example, to make the transition to wetter farming practices, to give them the confidence that there is the financial support to allow that transition, for example. And there still needs an element of funding for conventional restoration, that we've always done. There's a lot more that needs to be done both in the lowlands and the uplands in our region.
So just sort of coming back to that sort of restoring peatlands, that conventional restoration, like how do you restore a peatland?
Over to you, Helen.
How does that work?
Job number one is to raise the water table. So we do that through a process of installing deep trench bunds. Now, a deep trench bund is a tight underwater seal that prevents water from moving on being lost on the surface, but also underground. So we will dig a 1.5 metre, 2 metre trench. The peat that's excavated from the digging of that trench is then put back in and packed in to create that tight underwater seal. So we always put the bunds around the perimeter to obviously stop any water being lost from the land or flooding next door, which is always frowned upon. But we also put the bunding throughout the site to create cells, which allows us to not only move water around the site as and where we need it, but it also relieves pressure on that perimeter bund, because if you have too much of a build-up of water on that perimeter, you'll blow your bunds. Ooh. So yeah, that is job number one, raise the water table and then maintain that water table. If you do your bunding properly, you shouldn't have too much of an issue with that. And then the next stage is to bring the vegetation in. So if it's a particularly degraded site, you may do some vegetation removal or mulching before you put your bunds in, and that's the removal of things like scrub, dense melinia, bracken, and all species that you don't really want on the bog and that will dry out the peat.
And which are only there because it's dried out, really. Yeah.
And then we usually do large-scale planting. So we will plant cotton grasses and sphagnums because, like I said earlier, they're the engineers of the habitat and they will kickstart that return of lowland raised bog vegetation. Even though the peat is degraded and may have been under agricultural practices for many years, it's amazing what remains in the seed bank and what will pop up when those wet conditions are created. On our holiday moss site, which is over near Rainford, it was bone dry. It was under bracken, bramble, silver birch, and we've had not holly. What am I talking about? We've had heather colonise the site naturally from the seed bank, and that's a site that hadn't been re-wet in over a decade.
Brilliant. So can be a little bit of a, if you build it, they will come.
Absolutely. You get a few nice surprises along the way, which is quite nice.
That's fantastic.
So I think once you get the hydrology, the water table right, that's the key thing for peatland restoration, then once you kickstart the revegetation process, then it is amazing what does come back. I mean, the Little Woolden Way was absolutely devoid of any vegetation at all. Then we had to do a lot of what we call restoration planting, and we did a lot during the COVID lockdown. So two poor members of our team planted 70,000 plug plants on their own during that really hot summer. Do you remember the first lockdown? So some sites need more intervention in terms of restoration planting than others, but the key thing is getting the hydrology, the water table, back to where it needs to be.
So you get that water table back, you bring back the plants, and then what about wildlife? So tell me about the large heath butterfly.
The large heath butterfly is the megastar of the Manchester and Lancashire bogs. So also known as the Manchester Argus. It's a butterfly, unsurprisingly, and a stronghold for it in Lancashire is our Winmarleigh Triple SI side. Unfortunately, it has been missing from Greater Manchester for about 100 years, lost due to drainage through the Industrial Revolution and reasons that we've talked about already.
And loss of their sort of the two plant species that they really rely on.
Cross-leaved heath is their big sort of feeding plant. So we did a great reintroduction programme a handful of years ago where we took
gravid females
from Winmarleigh, and it was in a partnership with Chester Zoo, and then we released the pupa onto Astley.
Yep, onto Astley Moss.
Onto Astley Moss,
2020, I believe.
So it's part of the GM Great Manchester Wetlands Partnership, working with partners, and through that they have a sort of reintroduction. Working group, I suppose, or
it was slightly before group. My time.
Yeah, and so it's working with partners in the Great Manchester Wetlands that we managed to make this amazing reintroduction of the large heath butterfly. So from where they're still holding on in North Lancashire and taking, say, gravid females, working with Chester Zoo to bring them on, and then having the pupas put back on to Astley Moss in Greater Manchester. And we had butterflies for the first time in over 100 years since Queen Victoria out on Astley Moss. And we've done further supplementary reintroductions since then. And Helen, you had to do a lot of surveying every year to make sure they're doing okay?
Yeah, so I survey the population up at Winmarley, our stronghold and our donor population. We tend to do that through May and June of every year, out on the site every week, walking a transect. And the population up there is doing incredibly well.
That's brilliant. And what about the population at Astley? Has that been a bit challenging?
It's doing okay. I mean, last year was generally a bad year for butterflies per se. Like I think it's well recognised. So we were a bit worried about what the surveys would show us this year, but they are there. There's definitely a male and a female, and they were, can I say it? Definitely creating more future butterflies.
Well, that's what we want them to be doing.
So hopefully we'll have more next year. But I think depending on what happens with the surveys next year, there is talk also of doing another sort of translocation this time of, collecting gravid, so that's the females which have the eggs, and popping them directly out onto Astley moss as another way of trying to boost numbers. But it's just one. We're looking at reintroducing other species as well, so we're doing work to bring back the white-faced darter dragonfly, another species that has been lost due to habitat degradation, and the bog bush cricket, bolstering the numbers. So they're all little tiny insects, but they're really cool. And it's about creating, going from a bog that was degraded and just not functioning as a bog to re-wetting it, bringing back vegetation, bringing back those key inverts, and then building up from there really. So I mean, we'd like to do more plant reintros. That is sort of our next big focus, because while we've got the cotton grasses and the sphagnums doing well, we need to start looking at the next trophic layer of plants, so your sundews, your bog asphodels, white beet sedge, and so on. And we did a little trial in Winmarley a couple of years back that has been successful, and we'd like to roll that out on a large scale across sections of our sites that are ready and can support those species, because it has to be, the water table has to be stable, the conditions have to be acidic, and if we haven't got those conditions, then those plants simply won't survive. So we're very much looking to survey all of our sites and see which parts of them are in the right condition to be able to then do this next stage of plant reintroduction. But that would be a really exciting step forward. What's that other carnivorous plant we get on bogs? The one that's in the aquatic one?
Lesser bladderwort.
That's the one, because I just want to mention that because that's a really cool plant as well. Is it the fastest?
It's one of the fastest creatures, living things on Earth.
Yeah. In
that it can detect and react to prey in under 1/10,000th of a second.
You're good with your facts, Jenny.
It's so cool, and it just looks like a bit of slimy pondweed that lives in a bog pool.
So people, I think that's what we want to highlight is, you might look at a peat bog. If you're me, you might think about chocolate cake. But other people might go, oh, that's not very exciting. But if you really get up and close, you see these amazing, unique things going on right under your nose.
Absolutely. I can attest to having been out on peat bogs with the team, and nobody actually looks up. Everyone just wanders around.
Also, because you don't want to fall into it. Yeah. I was going to say, you might be up and close at first off, just because you've fallen over and you got your face in it.
So what kind of challenges are remaining for our peatlands? What is stopping us being, surrounded by wonderful, healthy peatlands that are helping us to fight climate change and the biodiversity crisis? What more do we need?
Funding? I mean, yes. There is competing pressures, isn't there, I think? As we've talked about wetter farming, and there's, how do you balance agriculture and conservation? So that's always going to be an ongoing thing. And in Chat Moss, one of the pressures is turf production, actually. I think people are much more aware of sort of peat-free campaigns and not buying your bags of compost. But I think there's less known publicly, for example, about the issue with turf, feed grass turf, being grown on agricultural peat soils. And, that's essentially peat extraction. Because every time a roll of turf is taken off and sold in wherever, I was going to say B&Q, but I probably can't say a name.
And other places.
Yeah. If that's taken from a peat soil area, then that's removing, a few centimetres of peat soils every time. So that's a really damaging practice that is growing actually in the mosslands around Greater Manchester. And just thinking about, where those potted plants you buy in your supermarkets, what are they potted in? Where is it coming from? And I think consumer awareness is a opportunity and a challenge, I think. Also, if we want wetter farming to become more acceptable and maybe be competitive, those crops being competitive with other crops, I think if there was an awareness of the environmental benefits as well as, what the produce looks like, that would help. So I think there's a way to go with, raising awareness with consumers, I think, but also just funding.
Yeah, but it's also about, I think, making everybody aware, not just general public, but policymakers, about just how vital these habitats are, and to make sure that we can safeguard these habitats from development, so that they're not going to have, a multiplex or a car park or a block of flats built on them, or, housing estates or whatever. We need to be able to safeguard these habitats, to say, no, actually, these are as important as ancient woodlands, and we need to make sure that not 1 hectare goes under unnecessary development.
That's very true, actually, because Lowland Raised Bog is not listed as an irreplaceable habitat on sort of the list of irreplaceable habitats, which would give it a greater protection. I don't know. I haven't managed to find answers to why that is, but I would say that that's a habitat that cannot be, how do you say, it's irreplaceable because you can't recreate it in a lifetime, because it's just how slowly
recreate it somewhere else.
No.
You can plant a woodland.
Yeah, but peat bogs can only be on peat soils, so that so I think it makes it harder when planning developments are going through to argue the case for why we shouldn't be building houses on peat soils if they're not recognised as the irreplaceable habitats. I think so. That's one of the challenges we've had, and it's difficult because there is competing needs. So there's a need for agriculture and farming. There's a need for house building, to meet sort of demands and housing shortages. But there's also the need to protect the environment for the climate benefits it provides, but also the intrinsic nature of those habitats. And if we don't protect nature, we don't have anything ultimately.
Absolutely. You clearly love your peat.
I do like a bog, yes.
And they are extremely nice, I can attest. But what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? Why do you get up and sort of fight the peaty fight every day?
I mean, I will never see any of the bogs I work on in a condition that we would call good in my lifetime, because the process to get there is so long. But I don't know about you, but I'm incredibly proud to say, I helped kickstart that long restoration journey. And it's knowing that, decades from now, hundreds of years from now, potentially, that site could potentially be far, far down the road of restoration, close to back of what it would have been like, all because of the work that we've done over the last 5 years. They are incredible places, and the wildlife that you will see on, whether you go to Little Woolden, Winmarleigh, it's second to none.
I love that. And what about you, Sarah?
It's a mixture, really. I think I do it for the future, for the future of my son, because in terms of climate change, we see it happening already, and our peatlands can provide a really important part of the solution to mitigating the effects of climate change. So I think doing something that can have a positive impact and try and protect the future of our children, I think that's what drives me partly. I'm getting a bit choked up there. But also I think they're just really exciting places. You know, these like carnivorous plants are amazing, aren't they? Like who would think that we got carnivorous plants, you know, on the edge of Manchester? And I also think that culturally and historically they have such an exciting part to, you know, in the region's history. That when the contractor Little Woolden Moss are doing the restoration works, you know, they're uncovering what's called bog oaks, these trees that have fallen on that peatland thousands of years ago, and they're digging them up and as if they've just fallen, you know, yesterday, practically. And it's a piece of history. You can touch something that is thousands of years old. I think that is incredibly exciting. So they're exciting on different levels, both from a cultural, historic point of view, but also that's from the past, but for the future, what they can give us in terms of helping, with the climate crisis that we're facing.
Amazing. And what would you say, you know, to our listeners at home, what is it that, you know, your average person going about their day-to-day lives, what can we all do to help kind of support the future of our peatlands?
Buy peat-free. Buy peat-free compost.
Yeah.
That is number one. If you are big into your garden and your horticulture, you know, help us. Don't buy a medium that means a habitat has to be carved up for it. You know, buy your peat free, and you're helping to save a fragment of a habitat. Yeah. If it's good enough for Monty Don, then it should be good enough for everybody else. You know, but get out to your lowland raised bogs. Might I suggest you stick to the paths, stick to the public right of way. They are treacherous places, but they're places to be enjoyed. There are places, you know, that you can go and see some great wildlife. So get out and do a bit of exploring. And for so many people won't realise that they're on their doorstep. You know, go to our website, go and have a look at the sites and where they are in relation to where you live, and get out and have a look.
Just, let's get out and continue fighting that PT fight.
Absolutely. Be curious. Be curious about where your food comes from and what goes into putting that food in the shop shelves. Where does it come from? If it comes from West Lancashire, you might think, is that from a PT area? I wonder, what can I choose differently in future? As Helen's mentioned, you know, peat compost, but I think there is legislation coming in to support about the peat compost, but there's still going to be, you know, plants potted in peat or turf, grass turf, coming from peaty areas. So be curious, question, don't be afraid to ask, where does this come from? What does this contain? How can I do things differently?
Yeah, I'd absolutely say have a voice. You know, if you've got a development that's going to be on a local peat site, lobby your local MP, get out there with a placard and tell them that you're not happy and you don't want this in your local area. Be brave, and have that voice, because you're entitled to it. You know, at the end of the day, it's carving up a habitat that could potentially protect against climate change, that could have a huge impact for you and future generations of your family. So, you know, stand up and shout about it.
Brilliant. Oh, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your complete love of peat. And thank you so much for listening, everyone. If you would like to find out more, please go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. You'll get loads of information about all of our peatland projects and lots of other things that are happening right across Lancashire Wildlife Trust straight into your inbox. Also, could you consider supporting us as a member? Membership starts from just a couple of pounds a month, and literally every penny really does help go to amazing projects from our peatlands and right across all the habitats. So thank you so much for listening.